Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Dacey. I'm the Executive Director of the Sine Institute of Policy and Politics at American University. Happy to welcome you all back to our Sign of the Times Summer Series, where we're bringing in incredible practitioners, experts in their field to talk about the top issues of the day. We are thrilled today to be talking about the Great Divide, decoupling, pitfalls, and possibilities. Really a look at the U.S.-China relations. We're honored today to have our distinguished lecturer at Sine Institute, the former ambassador of Australia to the United States, and the founding partner in Bondi Partners. And we are so glad to have you back, Joe Hockey. Thank you so much for being here. I was just saying before, it's been April 20th, we did a conversation about the overall look at what this global pandemic has done. And so much has happened and evolved since April, but we wanted to take a real closer look at US and China, which has really been in the news. It's certainly something that's relevant and we need to talk about. So welcome back. Sine always loves to have you with us. One thing I think we could start with, Joe, is, what is your general perspective on this current state of the relationship between US and China and what's happening?
Well, thanks, Amy, and great to be with the Sine Institute again and all of the participants in this webinar. Look, it is a deteriorating relationship, quite obviously. And China is, under Xi Jinping, taking a much more aggressive stand in defence of its reputation and in support of its ambitions. And that means taking on the United States, which is, a very big ask. It's doing it in two ways. It's doing it economically, and it's doing it militarily. And the United States has never had a threat like this. In all of its modern existence, the US has either had a military threat, but never really a major economic threat from another nation. Yet China embodies both. And the US has struggled to understand how to manage that relationship. But now, in a very bipartisan way, you are seeing the United States take a very strong stand against China and expects its allies to join the battle.
But Joe, do you think this current situation, was it inevitable? Has this been an evolution, or are there factors today that just have exacerbated this and led us to where we are?
Well, on the one hand, it is inevitable because of the emergence of major economic and military competition for the United States, and especially given that there was a vacuum created by the demise of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. There was a vacuum in global affairs that various terrorist organisations have tried to fill, but now you've got an enormous challenge, particularly economic challenge, that the United States is not used to. A nation that can manufacture more and faster than the United States can. A nation that very aggressively steals intellectual property, but also has its own intellectual property resources. And a nation that is on the other side of the earth, but is very actively engaged in America's interested neighbourhoods. And at the same time as the US has shifted focus, as it happened under Obama, President Obama, from the Middle East, and shifted its focus because it's become more energy self-sufficient, and leaving more of the Middle East affairs to the Europeans or individual countries in the region. It shifted its focus to the Indo-Pacific. And look, by 2050, probably the case that 4 out of the 6 biggest economies in the world are in the Asia-Pacific region. If you look at not just China, but obviously Japan is still there. And then you've got the emergence of Indonesia, which is a huge country with strong compound growth. And of course, other countries like Vietnam and South Korea, But the one that is becoming a more and more significant player in the region and is a major threat to China is India. And we've seen the breakout of skirmishes on that contested border in the China-India border. And, China feels as though they're surrounded. And in a sense, they are. They've got a time-to-time hostile South Korea. They've got Vietnam, which they've had a number of wars with to the south. They've got Japan. They've got the US patrolling the South China Sea with allies. And then on the other side on the western side of the country, you've got an aggressive India, and to the north, an unpredictable Russia. So, they feel that they need to be aggressive in order to protect their interests.
It's interesting, Joe. I always love your insights, but one of the things that I think is unique, and not all of our viewers are going to know, is that you were ambassador during two different administrations.
Yes.
Not only two different presidents, but two different political parties, definitely two different. What was that like to see the relationship, and like you said, some of this was inevitable, but I think it's such a unique perspective. Not every ambassador, follows two or has to work with two different administrations. Was there striking differences that you saw going on and the work that you had to do under those two administrations?
Yeah, look, good question, Amy, because I'll take it back. Before I was ambassador, I was treasurer of Australia and I was chair of the G20. So I had a number of interfaces with Jack Lew and Janet Yellen and President Obama in my role as the chair of the G20. And we also had the situation where Australia was in a fairly unique position. The United States has one of its biggest trading surpluses with Australia. So Australia has a big trading deficit with the United States.
Right.
But Australia has a very big trade surplus with China. Right, and not many countries in the world can say that. I mean, there are 35 countries in the world who have China as their biggest trading partner.
Yes.
Only 26 countries have the US as their biggest trading partner. So China is a bigger trader at the moment. And Australia has a big trade surplus. So China needs Australian resources, particularly in iron ore. And I remember, when tensions were increasing between the US and China, and this is, 6-7 years ago.
Okay.
President Obama asked us to reduce our exports of iron ore to China to reduce their infrastructure spending, particularly in the light of Belt and Road. Now, that's never been said before. I'm saying it exclusively here to you guys because it was true, right? So he wanted us to reduce, and also the administration, which probably is well known, was dead set against Australia joining the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which was a Chinese initiative. Mm. And Australia had to choose between its economic security and its political security. At that time, we said, of course, we're going to continue to export to China. I mean, we're not going to stop exporting to China. And secondly, we are in the Indo-Pacific region, the Asia-Pacific region. We can't walk away from a development bank that is going to build infrastructure in our area. Sure, the Chinese have Belt and Road, but this is it. So I have seen a consistent thread. Having said that, initially, the Obama administration was, far less concerned about China. But I think China's behaviour, combined with not only the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but a range of other things, led to the United States believing that it had to start to take a leadership role in the Indo-Pacific region. And in a sense, community policy, it's chicken and egg. Did community policy against China come first, or was it economic military policy? I think they're both headed in the same direction, which is an anti-China position in more recent times.
A lot of people, that are listening, there's a certain perception of what a Cold War is. I think for some of us, it's like growing up and it was certainly U.S.-Russian relations, and you have this perception. Do you think the current situation is actually a Cold War? And if it is, what's our definition of a Cold War in 2020? And how is, how is that unique?
Well, I think there's, in relation to a Cold War, there's probably a bit of mystery about what your opponent is doing, in that case, the Soviet Union, and its behaviour in some of the satellite states. I think there is utter transparency about what China's up to at the moment, whether it be in the South China Sea or internally in its treatment of the Uyghurs, or even in its management of the coronavirus. I think China is struggling with the transparency of the modern world, and therefore it is much more open to immediate criticism. It's also not quite an ideological battle. Right. I mean, the members of the administration constantly, rightly talk about the Chinese Communist Party, but I don't quite see it as a communist regime. I mean, when I first went to China, as a 12-year-old, that was very much a communist country. It was a very different scene to today, where Alibaba's one of the biggest companies in the world. I mean, there's very commercial. There are many commercial activities with a profit motive out of China.
Do you think countries like China, in some respects, we have a political system where it's very set and our leadership can change. We're in the middle of a national election. And so I'm sure the world is watching. I'm sure China's watching to see what's going to happen in the fall with our, executive branch and what's going to happen with our leadership there. Is there a sense that because it changes and it evolves, you wait things out? Do you try? I mean, it's such a different way, we don't have these decade-long, different decades-long series of leadership. How does that affect the relationship, or how maybe China views that as well?
Well, a very, very senior person in the Chinese government said to me, I remember the exact conversation in 2016. He said, Joe, how's democracy going for you? Look at China and look at India. Who's doing well, who isn't? Yeah. And there was almost a contempt for democracy. And of course, they come from, the dictatorship of Mao Zedong, and, a core belief that, and it's still prevalent in parts of China, vast parts of China today, that the Chinese Communist Party is even bigger than China. The stability and endurance of the Chinese Communist Party is the primary goal for the nation. Now, that's very different to what we believe here. Yeah. And I think what they're trying to do is understand democracy, but also use democracy. They don't want democracy. There was this misguided view 10, 15, 20 years ago that China would inevitably end up a capitalist democracy. It's got the capitalist, but it hasn't got the democracy. Yeah. And I don't think that's going to change, because the biggest threat to the rule of the Chinese Communist Party is insurrection fueled by capitalism. So Xi Jinping has had the crackdown on corruption and systemic corruption. And sure, there was plenty there to crack down on, but it's also been a tool used to enforce and reinforce the power of Beijing. And we've seen it recently in Hong Kong. So, look, I think at first they thought they could negotiate with Donald Trump. Then they felt they could take advantage of Donald Trump. I think now they're just sitting back and a bit bewildered and, waiting to see what happens in November. But the one thing you and I know, both sides of politics have pretty much the same view about China. I mean, that's one of the only things that's bipartisan in DC.
Well, that's interesting, because one of the things, as you talk about leadership changes, is maybe they do have some different ways to approach trade. And so trade is a huge thing that I'm sure China looks at, and what leadership will evolve on that and change on that. Certainly you've been involved in and seen these, over the course of 2 administrations. Um, under this new trade, under the current trade agreements, are you optimistic that China's going to meet purchasing commitments under the phase one trade agreement? Is this something that, again, in this election year, is evolving, or what has trade, how has it been shaped, and what are we going to be seeing in this Trump, to see out the Trump administration? What's happened so far?
Well, China's not going to meet its commitments. And after all, it's not a proper trade deal. It's just basically a memorandum of understanding. And if it were a trade deal, it'd have to go to Congress. And I'm pretty sure any trade deal with China would never get through this Congress, either Democrat or Republican, without significant change. I helped to negotiate a free trade agreement with China. And we did so in record time. But inevitably, you're a bit of a price taker when you're dealing with China, because it's just that monstrous consumer market. I mean, it's huge, right? And will be bigger than the US as a consumer market in the next 15, 20 years. So they call the shots in some of the negotiations, but we got a really good deal for Australia. And it was more about access to markets, because it's still a heavily regulated market. Amy, the bottom line is China is using its economic muscle in order to gain political power. There's no doubt about that. And it negotiated an agreement with the United States because it wanted to influence the United States on certain policies, be it potentially Huawei coming in for 5G, or to get the US to take a more agreeable position on the South China Sea, and any number of things. Mm-hmm. That didn't work, and I don't think it should work. China is now very aggressively using its state-owned enterprises in various markets, and it's using bullying and intimidation tactics in places like Africa and in Guinea in order to gain benefits. In some countries, it owns the government. In some countries, it's really unsophisticated in its approach, and to gain influence. I mean, in Australia, it's been really very unsophisticated in the bribery, intimidation, and corruption potentially of Australian politicians to change China policy. It's been really rudimentary, and the Australian intelligence agencies are right on top of it, and they've exposed it, but they're going to keep trying because they can. And the US has confused them, I think, successfully. But, there's a long way to go.
It's interesting. We talk so much sometimes about the macro level and these big trade agreements and how the governments are interacting. Did the Chinese people see a financial impact due to COVID-19 that, and the coronavirus pandemic that we've been seeing in the United States? I mean, was the impact, on the individual, like these businesses shutting down, people are high unemployment rates? Like, I don't think it's always talked about. So I think people would be interested to know what the impact was on the individual.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you've seen a significant economic downturn, even on the manufactured numbers that come out of China. They've had to admit there's been a significant downturn in economic activity, and they shut down vast parts of China. But also, I've got a friend that has visited somehow 9 cities in China over the last month or so. And he told me that the coronavirus is ripping through China and it's not being reported. He's in a manufacturing business and sources stuff out of China. And so there isn't any real transparency. And I think that's pretty frustrating for the world.
Sure.
And the second thing is, if you have the major economic downturn in export markets like Europe and the United States, well, of course, the manufacturing, in particular in the South China and southeast of China, has come off. I mean, and they haven't got any safety nets like you do here. Yeah. So
interesting, yeah.
They close their factories. The people don't get food. They don't have jobs. There's no safety net, and that's and that's where you start to get civil unrest in China, right?
Right.
So.
Right. Well, it is interesting, like you said, the transparency, because what we talked about back in April is that, this isn't isolated. What's happening in all these countries are affecting each other.
Oh,
So certainly, this is interactive, and we've seen what a flare up in one part of the country and how it affects, both health wise and then certainly financially. You said earlier on, Joe, that it's literally, economic and military, challenges between the two countries. And we've talked a lot about the economic, but I just wonder, would you characterize China's recent actions as increasingly aggressive? Particularly we look at what relates to the activity in the South China Sea. Just take, for example, what do you mean by this, like military, and do we see an aggression that's, again, maybe inevitable? Like, has it been in other administrations? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, they've got a lot of fronts that they're making life difficult for neighbours or challenging neighbours, be it Japan, be it in the South China Sea, or be it India. But also they're very aggressive in their cyber activity. Recently, it was revealed, the Prime Minister of Australia revealed that, and we never named them, but it was pretty obvious it was China, a government-sponsored attack, cyber attack, on every government institution in Australia, national,
Every
state,
government institution.
local. And our Prime Minister announced a number of things. And part of that was because we took a stand about having an international investigation into the basis of COVID, and they didn't like that.
Yeah.
So after the cyber attack, the Prime Minister announced that he was committing billions of dollars to upgrade Australia's offensive cyber capability, and will be recruiting up to 500 people with the capacity to respond and support Australia's cyber activities. And there's been a number of further developments. Here in the United States, Christopher Wray gave a speech earlier this week, which people must read, and it was at the Hudson Institute. And just the title indicates what it was. This is the director of the FBI, quote, the threat posed by the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party to the economic and national security of the United States. Now that's from the director of the FBI in a COVID environment, giving a speech, and the speech in detail names the individual Chinese activists, state-sponsored activists that have been stealing intellectual property and undertaking a range of other things against corporations and so on in the United States. I mean, it's extraordinary stuff. And of course, Vice President Pence, Secretary of State Pompeo, a number of others, and a number of Democrats as well, right, as Republicans in the House and the Senate, have been giving very aggressive statements, making very aggressive statements about China. Very forward-leaning legislation as well. I mean, there's been a number of initiatives come out of the Congress that are punitive and are targeted against China. So we are, in a cycle of deterioration here in the relationships, and the US, is going to be interesting how committed the Europeans are to supporting the United States on this, but there are a number of other countries in the Indo-Pacific region, like Japan, India, Australia, lesser degree Vietnam, a few others that are, supportive to varying degrees of what the United States is doing. And China is working overtime with its, particularly through its undiplomatic diplomatic corps, to either intimidate or cajole or encourage other countries to support China on a number of different things.
Well, it's interesting too, as you mentioned this cyber threat, because the traditional military threats, strengthen military force, these cyber threats, they're heightened during a time when we're ever more reliant on them as we isolate and work from home and rely on all these systems to provide us our basic, needs, first of all. And I think secondly, this is where the vulnerability happens with every country at an equal level. I mean, nobody has gotten it perfectly right on their cybersecurity or how they, I mean, you have to be ever vigilant. So it's interesting that is one of the biggest threats that we can see, and that we've got real-time examples of attempts to try and capitalize on that.
Well, that's right. You know, there's the malevolent efforts to try and hack into your systems in order to create instability, to cause damage, to cause loss. That's one thing. And there's the other side of it, where you are actively supported by the state in going in and stealing intellectual property,
right?
Which is theft. It's straight out theft. And you know, it's very serious. It's very serious. And I think for a long period of time, the US was far too tolerant of it. And that's because a lot of people in New York and Wall Street were arguing that, look, you know, the costs of losing some intellectual property are far less than the opportunity for us to be able to sell one can of Coke to every person in China each day, right? Or something, you know, the equivalent.
Right.
Now they've realised that they can't get that at any rate. So a lot of major corporates, American corporates, have now drawn back to the US economy, particularly with the US growth over the last couple of years, drawn back into the US economy and worked out that the cost of doing business in China is too great for them without sufficient reward. The more that China becomes unpredictable and regulates its economy, the less attractive it is for business partners around the world who previously were advocates for China to continue to be advocates for China. So you see, for example, in Australia, some of the strongest advocates for the partnership are major iron ore suppliers to China. I mean, they've made major fortunes. They're never the critics of their biggest customer, of course. You can understand that.
Sure.
But there's a flip side. There's a flip side, and a big flip side. And, you know, it'll be interesting to see how it pans out over the next 12 months because, you know, the one thing we do know is that there's been here in the US, according to recent research, a massive deterioration in the level of support for China amongst American households.
Right.
Now, you can multiply that around the world, because the one thing the coronavirus did was it took China into every lounge room, in every home, everywhere in the world. And that, you know, if you didn't know China then, you did, you know, you
right.
knew about China, and they cop the blame for it, right? And they cop the blame for it. Whether it's fair or unfair, they cop the blame for it. And it's had a material impact on the perceptions of China everywhere.
I would say, like, can you measure, like, was there, when you look at COVID-19 and the pandemic, will people look at the before relation and then after? Because there was a lot publicly, you know, that was talked about. And you talk about China's relation with the US impacted with the world, how, you know, can you mark in the sand, like the before and after? Was there subtle differences, or was it just exacerbated through the challenges we faced healthcare wise?
No, I think there's well, maybe it's a debate about whether it's called the China virus, right? I mean, it's, you know, we're going through quite a debate about vernacular here in the United States at the moment, and the line seems to keep moving in different directions. No one's quite sure whether they're being rude or inappropriate, or whether they're just stating a fact. So, and that's part of the pretty understandable national debate at the moment. But, you know, I mean, like, even at a local school here, there was a big debate about whether it should be called the China virus. And some teachers said, no, it's totally inappropriate and racist that it's called the China virus. And yet, you know, the MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, for all the Arabs out there, and I'm part Arab, that might have been racist, but it wasn't. That's where it came from. And I know SARS was not South Asian respiratory syndrome, but it was, you know, it was referred to it as that. But no one considered it as as racist, or the Spanish flu, or any of the others, right? I mean, the bottom line is, you know, and I caught an example of a Chinese diplomat in Australia going to a leader in Australia and saying, well, the coronavirus started in 2020 in the United States. Mm-hmm. I mean, a senior diplomat from China. And, you know, the reaction was, well, why is it called COVID-19 if it started in 2020? You know, right. I mean, these sorts of stupid lines from the wolf pack that's out there just undermines the tenor, and it compounds the view that China has covered up. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, Australia and a number of other countries did the right thing by having a proper and transparent investigation as to how this started. But China's not used to that. China's not used to transparency. It's threatened by transparency. It's threatened by freedom. And it's threatened by anyone that would suggest that it could lose face from its own decision making. And, you know, that's been the deterioration as well. They've made it worse than it should be.
Well, you know, it's interesting. We've talked on so many fronts. You've got this economic conversation about the challenges there. You've got this military cyber, you know, challenge, public perception. And then, you know, you mentioned the transparency issue. Does the U.S. have a clear strategy for relations with China if it's all those factors, and how do you navigate that to kind of move forward? And certainly there's things that the two nations need and would be better if they, you know, did together. Can there be, if there's all those different factors contributing to the exacerbated, you know, relationship, is there a clear path moving forward?
What I've learned about the United States is that simply because of its scale, it takes a lot to turn a ship in a different direction. But when it heads in a different direction, it's unstoppable. And, you know, I think there is no doubt that the United States has turned its direction on China from encouragement to become a more open and transparent economy, a free trade economy, encouraging free speech and democracy, to now, you know, criticising it openly, even to the point of trying to humiliate it in relation to its behaviour, taking a much tougher stand on everything from supply chains for American goods through to aggressively pushing back, and I mean aggressively pushing back on any cyber attacks. You know, and it's regular and it's persistent and it's consistent. The recent activities of 2 American aircraft carriers in the South China Sea. I mean, if it was called, you know, it is the South China Sea, by the way. It's not, you know, if those activities were occurring off the coast of the US or Florida, you know, then, you know, the Americans might get a bit agitated, but that's a whole other story. The bottom line is that, you know, it's heading in a direction that is muscling up to China, and China doesn't like it and is endeavouring to muscle back. And it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because the president of the United States, who would normally set the direction on this, he's sort of keen to try and keep the door open with Xi Jinping, but at the same time, he's hammering away on the China virus, or giving it other names, you know, sending a bit of a mixed message about the relationship and the direction of the relationship. But everyone else around him is giving a pretty straight view of the relationship.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned there are these 2 world leaders that are interacting, and then, you know, U.S. China is interacting in a way. Are those tensions between these 2 countries? Do other countries around the world need to pick a side? You know, is it possible to toe the line, or is this literally like we're looking at like one of these games when we were kids and there was, you know, back and forth about who's going to line up with what side? I mean,
Well, it's kind of interesting because,
Navigate that if you're one of these other countries. Certainly Australia has to consider
yeah, yeah, I look, and
geographically, their financial commitments, their,
yeah. And Amy, Australia has ripped itself apart trying to work out how it balances the economic relationship and the security relationship. Yeah. And at various times, people in the US administration said, you've got to pick a side, right?
Yeah.
Well, actually, we don't have to choose between our history and our geography. It's not either or. It's about, about having a clear-eyed policy that we want China, like every other country in the world, to comply with international laws and to have an orderly process for engagement with other countries. And that's not a big ask.
Yeah.
It's a perfectly reasonable ask. That's what we want of China. China tries to bully us more than it engages with the United States. It attempts to bully Australia. That's how it operates. And bullying Australia by refusing to meet with ministers. Well, okay. Bullying Australia by saying, well, we might not allow our Chinese students to go to Australia. We might not buy some of your crops. Bullying Australia by saying, well, we're just going to leave some of your wine on the wharves because we don't think it's of appropriate quality. But the things they need, like iron ore or milk powder or other staples, yeah, you can get in, right?
Yeah.
And
There's enough of a dependency there on some things that you have to.
And they're actively, energetically looking for alternatives to the supply chains out of countries like Australia. For example, they are investing heavily in an iron ore mine in Guinea, which is, the African iron ore mines have enormous capacity and quality, real quality iron ore, right? So they're looking at alternative suppliers to Australia. And given Brazil, for example, has its big COVID issues, it's had unstable supply to China of iron ore. So Australia has been in an incredible position and the prices are really high. China, I'm sure, doesn't like that at all, but because of the politics, but they're just going about it the wrong way. I mean, and you just can't bully these third countries. A lot of countries don't have the capacity to stand up to bullies. They really don't, particularly when they've got, the closer you get to China, the more active, agents are for the Chinese, nationalism. I mean, we had a lot of Chinese students in Australia. We had one instance of, at one point, a car was dressed up as a Beijing police car and driven through the middle of one of our universities to send a message to the students that Beijing's watching, right? So we've had a lot of, nefarious sort of activity like that, which is really cumbersome and clumsy. But it's, it's about intimidating people and bullying people, and we certainly don't stand for it. A number of other countries have found, with the United States muscling up, with Australia and times the UK and a few other countries muscling up to defend their interests, not to attack China, but to defend their interests. A number of other countries have found the courage to be able to do the same. And or go some way.
There's obviously a lot of focus. We talked a little bit about the fall election in the United States, and that's going to change. There's a lot of big differences in the two campaigns and the two candidates about how they handle a lot of domestic issues. Certainly foreign relations, is a part of the conversation as well. And I'm just curious, you said there's a lot of similarities in how they would handle this, but, how would the strategy differ under a Biden administration versus a Trump administration, or do we not know all the elements now? I certainly, with his role in Foreign Relations Committee and in the Obama administration, like Biden does have some, history in this. Are some of these countries waiting to see what happens there? Would there be a big difference, do you think?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I'm not sure that, I don't think Joe Biden would be any weaker or stronger than Donald Trump on or the Trump administration, I should say, on the fundamentals of dealing with China. But there would be nuanced differences. Joe Biden is exceptionally experienced in international relations. He was a very strong supporter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The irony being that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a major threat to China, and by President Trump withdrawing and the failure to pass it through under President Obama, it was a win for China because the US was partnering with 11 other countries to form a trading bloc, the countries which were surrounding China. And when the US pulled out, it was Australia and Japan that led the charge to have, Trans-Pacific Partnership 11, basically. Right, if the US is not there, but the US can come in at any time. In response, China has been pushing the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership known as RCEP. And that's been in negotiations for years. And it basically is the whole of Asia. And it's a trade agreement, Asia for Asia. That seems to have stalled. It got momentum and then it stalled. And it didn't include the United States. So, and I think part of the reason it stalled, apart from coronavirus, is the fact that, who knows what we're dealing with in China? Who knows what we're dealing with in the region, right? Whereas the Trans-Pacific Partnership is up and running. And I expect, for example, that Britain, when it's out of the EU, will be one of the first, it'll be one of the first deals they sign because they automatically get 11 free trade agreements. So Joe Biden is a supporter of TPP and an advocate for TPP. Today, he's released part of his economic policy. He's focusing on, American supply chains, American manufacturing, buy American. That's exactly the same as Donald Trump. I mean, there's nuanced differences in the level of procurement and so on, but it's the same message that, Debbie Des Moines will hear in Iowa.
Right.
That is Joe Biden's about putting America first on trade, and Donald Trump is the same. And that's the way they will, I suspect, hear it. Mm-hmm. But I think it'll be an interesting period. And it depends a lot on who is in Joe Biden's team.
Can you help us understand a little bit about the Hong Kong security law, China relationship? Like what's happening for a lot of people who might not be following it, and how much impact is that happening and affecting, foreign entities? I think it's a very, timely conversation around that.
Well, just, in very simple terms, and we can take questions on this, but in very simple terms, when China and Great Britain negotiated for the handover of Hong Kong some years ago, there was an agreement with China that they would preserve a level of independence in Hong Kong for a fairly lengthy period of time. In doing so, China didn't want to deny immediately Hong Kong's right to democracy and an element of self-rule. And that worked in China's favour because Hong Kong was a capital market centre that helped to fund the growth of the Chinese economy. China pretty aggressively has pushed Shanghai just across the border as a competitor, and so relied less on Hong Kong for financial services and a range of other services than before. And gradually it put a python squeeze on Hong Kong. And in doing so, people of Hong Kong are very proud. They've got a very strong history, a long history of supporting democracy, of self-rule, of independence, albeit within the British framework. And so they started rioting. They started kicking up a stink. This represents a major threat to China because China says, well, hang I mean, China cannot afford to have instability. The Communist Party, they can't afford, if they want to retain rule, they can't afford for people to starve, because it's a basic tenet of the Communist Party that you'll feed the people. And they can't afford for them to be without work. But also at the same time, they can't afford to have dissent, open dissent. And of course, there was a lot of worldwide coverage of the Hong Kong riots, with the net result that China said, well, we've been humiliated by this, enough. We're now going to effectively apply all Chinese law to Hong Kong. The police will have no judicial review. We'll set up our police in Hong Kong. And in day one of the new laws taking effect, 300 people in China were arrested. And it's quite clear that the definition of dissent is broadly interpreted, not by any fair judicial process, but by the police themselves. So Australia, for example, has just warned its citizens, if they can, to leave China, because they might inadvertently be arrested for engaging in some form of dissent, where they could end up one way or another in prison for the rest of their days. It's just ridiculous. So the Python squeeze on Hong Kong has, has finally, taken the breath out of the body, and it's irking China immeasurably at the moment that Britain and Australia and probably Canada and a few other countries are providing safe haven for Hong Kong residents. I would hope the United States, it'll be interesting to see if the United States follows, because it's not the natural instinct of the president to do that, but it would send a clear message to China that, you've broken the international agreement, we're going to step in.
I want to go to a question James gave us, because it's so relevant to what we've been talking about. James mentions that stability in China is certainly the Communist Party's top goal. So his question is, how does this, we just talked about Hong Kong and the influence on this, how does rattling sabers around the region contribute to that goal? I think we talked about India a little bit earlier and stuff too. And so I think James wants to know, is that a part of the strategy to do that?
For China to rattle the sabers?
Yes, around, yeah.
Well, it's about exerting influence. And, I think China, so I can't help but tell the story. Can I tell my story now? I've been hanging on the whole so I went to China as chair of the G20 in just after when they were hosting APEC around 2015-16, and Lo Ji-wei, the finance minister, asked me to speak on behalf of the finance ministers of the world of APEC to the Premier of China and the leadership of China in the Great Hall of the People, we received a warm welcome. The Great Hall of the People actually is 7 different halls for anyone that hasn't been in there, on Tiananmen Square. And I just thought to myself, I'm just not going to sit here and say thanks. I've got to make a point, and a respectful point. But I mentioned the Premier and to the whole leadership there that I first went to China when I was 12 years of age, and I stood outside that building on Tiananmen Square. And at that time, it was 1977, everyone was wearing green suits or blue suits. No building was more than 4 stories high. There were no cars, virtually no cars. Everyone was on push bikes. There was no pollution, no neon signs. It was at 6 o'clock, all the lights virtually went out. It was a very different environment. And it's true. I have seen the most number of people in the history of humanity liberated from poverty by China's emergence over the last 30 years. We all have. Anyone that believes in humanity should celebrate the fact that China has done so well. But China has done it well because it embraced capitalism. And of course, the Chinese looked at me and gasped at that moment when I mentioned that they embraced capitalism. But in fairness to Premier Li, and to the others. In response, he said, it's not capitalism we've embraced, it's enterprise. And that might seem very nuanced to us, but that's the difference between having a communist government and not. So they know that enterprise has lifted their people out of poverty. It has. They need to protect enterprise, in their view. They need to protect their supply chains. They can't fall behind in innovation. Therefore, they'll steal it. They can't afford to be held hostage on resources and energy because that makes them vulnerable. And at the same time, there are some hawks in the United States talking about a containment policy on China. I mean, this is not, this is not 1930s Japan, where you stop selling them oil and say to them, well, bad luck, and Japan then starts invading countries to get its oil, because no country's going to stand back and have another country cut its supply chains so that its people starve. And China's very fearful of a containment policy. And some crazy hawks talk about a containment policy, but we're beyond that. You can't have China as a top trading partner of 35 countries, one of the major trading partners of the United States and of vast parts of Europe and all other countries. You can't have the second biggest economy in the world, on some measure even the biggest economy in the world. You can't have a containment policy. That will lead to war. There's no doubt about that. And it'll be horrific. So let's find a way through. And I think this concept of being tough on China, on the one hand, but also continuing to engage with them, is probably the right policy. It's infuriating for them because, it's humiliating, but if they're going to behave badly, they'll be treated badly. If they behave like a reasonable and hugely influential global power, then they'll be treated respectfully for that as well.
And is that kind of the beginning of a blueprint in an ideal world, what that relationship would look like? Like, what would that relationship look like, US and China in ideal?
I think it does need engagement. And the engagement's got to be based on mutual respect. And they will say that no one's showing us respect. I mean, we're coming to our rightful place in the world as a major dominant power. I mean, I was just reading something, the other day, and Napoleon said, be careful about waking up China. He said, let China sleep. When she wakes, she'll shake the world. Napoleon Bonaparte. And, there's an argument to that, right? But just simply because of its scale. But everyone tends to ignore some of the internal challenges. I mean, the thing about the United States is it's so transparent. The whole world, whether they like it or not, turn on the nightly news and then you see the United States raw and unfiltered. Internal fights, arguments, protest movements, the good and bad, fully on display. China tries to control its message. It can only be good, and it doesn't reveal what is bad. And in doing so, it invites speculation. It invites distrust. It invites the concern of threatened nations who aren't prepared to just stand back and let China have its hand. And those countries, when they push back against China, China sees it as a slight. Because so much is about face. It's about, preserving face, preserving reputation. So I think for a long time, a lot of countries endeavoured to work closely with China, to engage with China. And certainly when I was in Parliament, it was China, China, China. How can we engage, get to know them, travel up there all the time, meet lots of ministers. It's a great opportunity. What a terrific country. We were doing that. But then would come a cyber attack, or then there would come corruption of some senators, or then would come a bullying tactic, or then would see a more aggressive behaviour by state-owned enterprises in our jurisdiction. And all of a sudden, we weren't good enough for them. We were not respectful enough. but they were harming us. And, well, either out of self-respect, you'll push back, or you'll just humiliate yourself and roll over. And some countries have humiliated themselves and just rolled over. But now the United States has muscled up. Countries have been prepared to take a stronger stand.
That's interesting, because that's one of the other questions, and I think you've answered some of this, but one of our viewers was wondering, so what role has and should Australia play in this U.S.-China relationship? You've mentioned a lot of just examples of things that have happened with Australia-China, but what role does it play in this, back and forth between these two countries, and what role could it play?
Well, there was one day, a pretty extraordinary time. And it was 2004, from memory. And we'd just been re-elected in government in Australia. And the President of the United States and the President of China both wanted to be the first to address the new Parliament in Australia. It was really kind of extraordinary. It was a momentous occasion, and because we're at the far end of the earth. For a start, it's a long travel, right? And secondly, there was this sort of arm wrestle. In the end, our Prime Minister, John Howard, said, look, President Bush is going to do it first because, he's for various reasons. And the same week, the President of China came down and addressed the Parliament, gave a very good speech. Now, it's tough. It's tough to get that balance right. You've also got to be respectful of the diaspora. I mean, there are, a million Australians out of 26 million, a million Australians speaking Mandarin or Cantonese every night at home. Plus, we have a vast number of students.
Yeah.
And China has been a part of Australia's history, since Whitefellow arrived, almost right back to the very beginning.
Right.
So there's no denying the relationship. It's just, it's just a question of how you manage the domestic politics as well as the international.
Right. Well, Joe, if you can believe it, our hour is already up. I think we could go on and on with this topic. And I don't want to wait another 3 months because things are evolving and changing so much. It will be interesting, and maybe we can talk a little later on and, in the beginning of the fall semester, how much this election is impacting globally and what people are thinking and considering, and how things, could be very different after November, the same after November. We just don't know yet, and so I think it's impacting and influencing a lot of these things, and certainly not preparing for a pandemic. And as you told us back in April, we have a financial and a healthcare crisis happening simultaneously. And so the impact of that ongoing. So we are honored to have you as a distinguished lecturer at American University. We're going to have a new group of students coming in the fall, and we'd love for you to kind of share your wisdom with them as well. So.
Well, that's great, Amy, and thanks. And to the new students that come in the fall, the good news is they wouldn't have heard the stories, so I could use the same story.
We'll be sure to bring you back. Again, everybody, please stay updated on SIGN. Join our social media channels. Make sure to sign up for our newsletter. And please look at Bondi Partners as well, their website, and find out what our good Honorable Joe Hockey is talking about and is up to. Thank you so much. We look forward to our next event. And Joe, we look forward to having you back for another conversation.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye now.